The sun rose softly over the undulating fields of Provence, spilling golden light over meadows kissed with morning dew. Wheat stood tall, shimmering like a sea of whispers. A gentle breeze stirred the wildflowers and sent a slow rustle through the hedgerows where birds sang their gentle tunes. It was a world still unaware of the great sorrow that would soon sweep across its quiet corners. You were called Alaric, a simple man of the land, born of humble roots. Your days were measured not in minutes but in seasons. The soil remembered your grandfather's hands. The trees whispered stories of your mother's voice as she sang lullabies beneath their boughs. You lived in a village that barely touched the edge of a map, if such maps ever found their way into your hands. A place too small for ambition, yet full enough with life. The village of Bellamere, nestled in a sleepy valley, had perhaps 100 souls. You knew them all. You helped birth their calves, repair their fences, and carried grain to the miller's stone. There was no money exchanged, only favors, blessings, and the occasional loaf of bread. The rhythm of life beat slowly, like the steady pounding of the flax comb or the cadence of prayers spoken in the chapel under the great oak. The chapel was where you found solace. You did not fear hell, nor did you truly understand heaven, but the hush of the stone sanctuary, the way candlelight flickered across the ancient walls, gave you peace. The priest, Father Odric, had grown bent and quiet over the years. He rarely preached fire and brimstone. Rather he spoke of mercy, patience, and silence, the kind of silence that held a presence rather than absence. And in this stillness, your soul found rest. Your home was modester, timber-framed dwelling with daub and wattle walls, and a thatched roof that whispered with the wind. A goat shared your yard, 3 hens shared your mornings, and a cat shared your secrets. You had no family, but missed none. A quiet life was your truest kin, but not all was serene. That spring, rumors floated in on the backs of travelers, whispers of a sickness far to the east, in lands you'd only heard of in the priest's scriptures, and the wanderers' tales, Constantinople, Kaffa, places that sounded like incantations. They said a ship had come to Genoa with no living crew, only shadows and silence. The words passed from mouth to mouth, losing shape and gaining dread, but you thought little of it then. Stories were common, and fear often bloomed from ignorance. Still, something in the air shifted. The bees came later than usual. The geese did not nest. And that spring, the rains did not stop. Fields flooded. Grains sprouted with rot. The village healer, old Maylene, looked to the sky with troubled eyes. She whispered of balance being undone. You watched her bury her charms deeper beneath the elder tree. In Bellamere, people trusted the old ways. Herbs, charms, smoke, and prayer. But you, perhaps moved by something quiet and unspoken, began to notice more. You began to observe which herbs soothed fever, which leaves quelled cough, which waters ran clear even after storms. You didn't know it yet, but these small acts of attention would one day make all the difference at the midsummer feast. The last before the plague reached your world, there was laughter in the air and roasted lamb on the spit. Banners of woven grass and blue flax blossoms were hung from branch and beam. Young ones danced barefoot through the glades, their cheeks red with cider. The music was not of instruments, but of voices and clapping hands. You sat beneath the twilight sky, watching fireflies gather like stars fallen to earth. Beside you, Father Audric spoke softly. Something stirs beyond the mountains. The Lord tests the fields before the harvest. You asked him what he meant. He only looked to the east. That night, in your dreams, you saw a black mist curling through narrow streets. It did not scream or howl, it whispered. You awoke in a chill, the goat bleating at the door. The stars were still out, and the world, for now, still turned. What you did not know, what none of Bella Mary yet knew, was that in less than a year, over half the souls who danced beneath that midsummer sky would fall silent. The Black Death was coming, but you had begun to listen, you had begun to notice, and that, dear listener, would one day matter more than anything. Far to the south, where the Ligurian Sea meets the crescent of stone and salt, the port of Genoa stirred beneath the weight of early summer. Genoa, proud and bustling, her docks lined with merchant vessels and the shouting of traders, had long been a jewel of the Mediterranean. From the east, from the lands of silk and spices, ships arrived with wonders beyond imagining, saffron, lapis lazuli, and cloth woven finer than breath. But in the spring of 1347, something else arrived. It came first as silence. One morning, just as the harbour's bells began their slow toll, a vessel drifted into the port. It moved without sails, without voice, without motion but the tide. The watchman who spotted it noted how the ropes swayed limply against its masts, as though no hand had ever tied them. Its deck was empty of life. The sailors who should have been scrambling to moor and unload were nowhere to be seen. A small crew rowed out, muttering prayers under their breath. They boarded with caution, blades at their hips, expecting pirates or plague, though none had ever truly seen the latter. What they found made the eldest among them cross himself and weep. The sailors aboard the ghost ship were dead, not by sword, not by starvation. Their bodies bore strange marks, black swellings beneath the arms, livid patches upon the skin, and mouths frozen open, as though death had come mid-scream. Rats skittered through the holds, and fleas leaped from body to body, hungry and blind. One crewman would later recall the smell not rot alone, but something older, something wrong. The port's magistrates, fearing divine wrath, ordered the ship burned, but it was too late. The fleas had already found new hosts. The cargo spices, fabrics, and grain had already changed hands. Genoa, in all her splendor, had welcomed the pestilence with open arms. Yet even as the first fevers bloomed, the city did not understand. Illness was no stranger to Genoa. Children caught chills. Old men coughed blood in winter. But this was different. The sick fell swiftly, their pain sharp and strange. Fevers burned bright and sudden, and black buboes rose, like cursed pearls upon their flesh. Within days, even the healthiest stumbled. Markets emptied. Bells tolled without rest. Word travelled by road and sea, whispered along with the salted wind. Ships that fled Genoa were turned away from other ports. Venice shut her gates. Pisa burned its docks. But fear travels faster than feet, and already the shadows stretched across the coast. Not all despaired blindly. In the quieter quarters of Genoa, healers and monks began to notice. Those who stayed indoors fared better. Those who burned their clothes and boiled their water, though few knew why, sometimes survived. Herbalists noted how rosemary seemed to soothe, and how smoke from juniper did not choke the air the way others did. A few wise women began to close their doors to strangers, and their homes remained untouched, at least for a time, and far away. In your little village of Bella Mare, the first tattered rumours began to reach the ears of the wandering friar who passed through twice each season. He brought no goods this time, only silence and stories. At the hearth of the village longhouse, with a bowl of thin ale in his hand, he spoke gently. "Genoa bleeds," he said. "A sickness has come that carries no mercy. It floats on the breath, creeps beneath the skin, and leaves not even the crows to feast. The dogs will not eat the dead." Around the fire, you sat with others' leather hands resting on knees, eyes wide but disbelieving. Death had always come in ones and twos, never in droves. Plague was a word for stories, not for life. You watched the friar. He spoke not to stir fear, but because he could not hold it alone that night. Lying beneath your thatch roof, you thought of the sea, of Genoa, and of the silent ships that carried shadows in their wake. You had never seen the sea, but now it felt closer than the village well, so you did something small. You gathered rosemary and sage, the plants old Mayline always said held heat. You dried them by the fire. You began to clean more often, to sweep, even where no dirt lay. It wasn't knowledge, it was instinct. An instinct, in those days, could save. Others in Bellamary began to mock the stories. They said it was divine punishment for southern sins, that the sea folk had grown too proud. But you listened. Quietly, attentively. That is how it begins, not with medicine, nor with miracles, but with listening. A few weeks later, a trader passed through with a donkey cart of dull blades and salted fish. He seemed pale, though he smiled still. He spoke of bodies stacked like kindling in Marseille, of dogs left to starve because they refused to eat their masters, of priests who blessed the dying, only to perish the next day. You watched him closely. You did not let him near, and when he left, you washed your hands in sage water, a small act, a quiet act. But in such acts, survival takes root. In Bellamori summer waned with little ceremony. The barley had been late to ripen, and the apples usually sweet by St. John's Day remained sour on their branches. The villagers blamed the rain, the sky, the passing of a comet seen briefly. One night in June. But in truth, there was something more, something that no one yet dared to name. It began with the animals. The hens stopped laying. The goat, once fond of nudging your hip for scraps, had grown quiet and lean, refusing clover even when fresh. A calf was born with lifeless eyes, and no one could explain why. Mayline said the spirits were restless, that something unbalanced was moving through the valley. People still laughed, of course. There was always room for laughter, even in worry. Life was too long and hard without it. At the tavern, men joked about Genoa and Venice. City folk with soft feet and softer bellies. One said with a grin, "They fall sick if the air smells different." But beneath the jesting, the air of unease thickened. Then came the day the bell tolled not for a feast or a wedding, but for old Beatrice, the baker's widow. She had been fine that morning, offering loaves wrapped in white cloth, but by nightfall her hands were blue and her breath came in fits. By morning she was cold. Father Odric buried her without sermon. Only you and Mayline stood by. That same week, 2 more fell ill, the tanner and little Lucette. Barely 10 summers. Old Ailing raved in fever, his skin hot as embers, his neck marred by swelling like a swollen plum. Lucette did not speak again after the first night. She merely stared, eyes wide and glassy, until her mother carried her into the chapel. She did not come out by the time the leaves began to yellow, the village knew. They didn't speak of the plague not yet, they used gentler words. The sickness, the sweat, the passing cough, words that made it feel less real, less ancient, less final. But it was real. You felt it in the hush between footsteps, in the way doors now closed faster, in the way Mayline began burning herbs, not for blessing, but for cleansing. She taught you which to gather: wormwood, yarrow, lavender. You learned to hang rosemary over lintels, to soak linens in boiled vinegar, to walk wide of those who coughed. These were not cures, but they were something. You began keeping to yourself more often. You worked the fields early, while mist still clung to the grass, and returned before the sun reached its peak. You stopped drinking from the shared basin by the chapel. You carried a cloth soaked in camphor and pressed it to your nose, when among others it was small wisdom, passed through whispers and instinct. One evening, as twilight slipped between the trees, Father Odric came to your home. He looked thinner than you remembered, his eyes shadowed. He did not step inside. "I will send word to the bishop," he said. "If there is still a bishop to hear it." You offered him bread. He shook his head. "You listen," he said. "You always have. Keep doing so. Listen to the land. It remembers more than we do." With that, he turned, his sandals silent against the path. In the days that followed, more fell sick. The butcher's son, the flax spinner's sister, and a shepherd whose name you never knew. They vanished, one by one. Some were buried quickly. Others left in their homes until the smell brought someone to notice. There were no more jokes at the tavern. The laughter had gone. People began to leave Bellamy, one cart at a time, carrying pale-faced children and dry-eyed mothers. They sought the forests, the hills, distant cousins in other hamlets, but few roads remained safe. Bandits had begun to prowl, and some villages closed their gates entirely. Refuge became as dangerous as the disease. You stayed, not from bravery, but from stillness. Your home was clean, your habits careful. You burned dried herbs at night and slept with your cat curled close to your side, warm and quiet. You prayed not for salvation, but for patience. One morning, you found a bundle left on your doorstep, bread wrapped in a scarf, with a sprig of mint tied to the knot. No note, but you knew it came from Mayline. A quiet kindness, a reminder that you were not entirely alone. The days shortened, the winds turned colder. The village seemed to shrink as people vanished behind shutters. No smoke rose from the chimney of the blacksmith's shop. The chapel bell no longer rang. Even the birds seemed to have flown. But youth, through care, through listening, through the smallest acts, remained untouched. You lit a candle each night and whispered the names of those gone. Not loudly, not tearfully, just enough for the wind to remember them. And still, the plague had not yet reached its peak, but your heart had begun to prepare. Fear is a strange beast. It moves like mist creeping where light fades, settling into corners and slipping into the hearts of even the kindest souls. It does not shout or rage, it whispers, and in Bella Mary, by the turn of October, fear had grown louder than the church bell had ever dared to ring. It wasn't just the sickness now, it was what it made of people. Neighbors once quick to wave now peered through cracks in shutters, barely nodding when paths crossed. Doors stayed locked, not only against the plague, but against one another. No one visited Mayline anymore, though her herbs still hung fresh and fragrant from her eaves. Children were not allowed outside. The laughter that had once rolled like a warm breeze through the village was gone, replaced by silence that clung to walls. It was in this silence that fear changed its shape. Suspicion began to bloom. Someone had to be blamed. Some said it was the travellers who had brought the curse, those who passed through on tired carts, their clothes tattered, their eyes distant. Others said it was Maylene herself, that her charms had turned from healing to harming, that the spirits she called upon had come for vengeance. There were whispers of curses, of secret gatherings in the forest, of signs carved into wood and stone. You watched it all unfold, quietly, your heart heavy. One evening, you saw a group of men standing outside Maylene's cottage. They didn't knock. They simply stood, arms crossed, eyes dark. When she opened the door, they said nothing. She closed it again, slow and calm, and the next day her window was broken. You went to her that morning. She was sweeping glass from the floor, humming to herself as though it were just another morning. But her hands trembled. "They fear what they don't understand," she said gently, her voice steady despite the weight in her eyes. "They always have. You stayed for tea. She gave you elderflower to carry home." Later that week, someone nailed a sign to the chapel door. It read, "Cleanse the village, cast out the wicked." The letters were crude, scratched in charcoal, but the message was clear. The sickness had become a mirror, showing people their deepest selves, not their flesh, but their fears. Even farther. Odric could no longer calm them. He still walked the lanes, his robes thinner now, his voice quieter. But when he preached in the square, fewer listened. They wanted certainty. They wanted a cure, a cause, a criminal. But the plague offered no logic. It touched one household and spared the next. It took the old and the young, the pious and the profane. It obeyed no prayer. One night, you awoke to shouting. A house had been set alight at the edge of the village to cobbler's home. His wife had fallen ill 2 days before. Some claimed it was mercy, others said it was madness. When the flames died down, nothing remained but ash and questions. You stood at the edge of the crowd, a cloth over your face, your breath shallow. You did not speak. You simply watched, and you remembered something Father Odric once said. Long before the sickness came in fire, we seek control, but fire answers to no one. After that night, you chose your company carefully. You continued your rituals, boiling herbs, cleaning with vinegar, avoiding crowds, but now you also guarded your presence. Too much kindness could draw suspicion. Too much caution could make others fear you knew more than they did. Balance, then, became your guide. You helped when it was safe to help. You offered food at a distance, placed by a doorstep and knocked on gently. You spoke only when asked, but always with calm, with warmth. You became a quiet presence, neither feared nor revered, only accepted. The cat still followed you. Birds still visited your garden, chirping in the thin morning light. Life, in its quiet way, continued, and amidst all this, you kept listening. You noticed how the sick often worsened when crowded, how fresh, aerial, open air seemed to ease their coughing. You began to think not of spirits, but of breath, of space. You slept with your window open, though the nights had grown cold. One morning, while walking past the edge of the forest, you saw something that stayed with you. A girl, perhaps 12, perhaps younger, standing alone near the trees. She wore a cloak too large for her, and her hands were wrapped in cloth. She did not cry nor speak. She simply stood, eyes wide. You approached slowly, carefully. She stepped back. You crouched low and placed a small loaf of bread on a stone between. Then you stepped away. She did not come forward, not that day, but the next morning. The bread was gone. A week later, You found a bundle of dried mushrooms in the same place. A silent exchange. A pact of trust between two souls lost in fear, choosing gentleness over suspicion. In the depth of fear, this is what mattered most. Not strength, not knowledge, but softness, stillness, patience. In that you were surviving, not just the sickness, but what it made of the world. The woods beyond Bellamary had always held their own stories. Long before the sickness, long before your birth, they had been whispered about as a place of old paths and older memories. Children were warned not to stray too far. Some said it. Lost monastery lay deep among the trees, abandoned long ago when its monks vanished in a single winter. Others spoke of ancient stones, moss-covered and humming with a voice only the night could hear. You had never wandered deeply, not until now. It was on a morning of thin frost and pale sun that you returned to the forest's edge, hoping to catch sight of the girl again, but she did not appear. The stone where you had left bread now held nothing. Only leaves, gently blown. Something drew you forward, not curiosity, not exactly. It was something quieter, pull, like the hush of prayer. You stepped carefully beneath the canopy, the branches bare and sighing with the breeze. The path was faint, more suggestion than trail, marked only by the occasional sign of human presence, a knot of cloth tied to a twig, a line of stones placed too evenly to be natural. After an hour's walk, you smelled smoke, not thick or choking, just the faintest trace of hearth fire, curling through the trees like a forgotten lullaby. You followed it until you reached a clearing, small and quiet, where 6 low shelters had been built from wattle, mud, and pine boughs. A ring of stones marked a fire pit at the center, where a pot bubbled slowly over quiet flames, and there, standing beside it, was the girl. She did not look surprised. Behind her, a woman emerged from one of the huts, then a man, then 3 others, faces lined, hands calloused, eyes calm. No fear, no threat, only stillness. You said nothing, neither did they. The forest spoke enough for everyone. The woman approached. Her dress was patched but clean. Her voice, when it came, was soft. "You've been careful," she said. "We watched you. We wondered if you'd come." Her name was Isabeau. She had once lived in a village east of Bellamary, a place long since empty. When the plague came, she and a handful of kin fled not to the next town, but to the trees. They brought no oxen, no carts, only what they could carry. They built shelters by hand, foraged, hunted, kept quiet. "We do not return," she said, "not even for the old chapel. The forest has accepted us now." Their group numbered 9, children and elders both. They did not mix with others, save rare exchanges like the bread and mushrooms you had shared. They boiled everything. Dried herbs by the dozen. Wore amulets, not for magic, but to remind themselves. The old ways mattered. Washing hands, avoiding breath, respecting space. Their rules were simple. Eat what is clean. Touch only what you must. Share nothing of the body, no cloth, no cup, no cradle. At night they sang. Not hymns, not chants, but lullabies. Gentle songs to keep fear from rooting too deep. You sat with them that first evening, near the fire, sharing stories in quiet voices. One man, Alban, had once been a bell ringer. His fingers had known the ropes of a grand cathedral. Now they shaped tools from flint and bone. You stayed until the moon rose high. When you stood to leave, the girl handed you something, a small sachet of dried juniper berries, wrapped in linen. For smoke, she said. Isabeau walked with you to the path's edge. You are welcome, she said, but only if you keep your caution. Out there, it feeds on those who forget. You returned to Bellamori with slow steps. The sachet warmed your palm. Behind you, the forest whispered in its old, knowing voice. It had seen worse. It had endured. Back in your cottage, you lit your own fire with care and hung the juniper sachet above the flame. The smoke curled sweetly through the rafters, mixing with the scent of dried lavender. You felt no miracle, no sudden promise of safety, only calm. A quiet breath drawn in and let out slowly. From that night forward, you walked to the forest every few days, never the same path, twice. You brought bread, nuts, honey when you had it. In return, they gave you dried thyme, smoked meat, or nothing at all, sometimes just a nod. It was not barter, it was trust. Bellamarie continued to wither. The village square grew silent. The healer's garden overgrew its boundaries. Father Odric stopped walking the lanes. You did not ask why, but you carried the knowledge of the forest with you. You boiled your water. You soaked cloths in vinegar. You breathed through fabric when around others. You avoided the sick, not out of coldness, but respect. You left bundles of food quietly where they were needed, never waiting for thanks. Each night you lit the fire and whispered the day's names. Those lost, those met, those remembered. The plague had not passed, but you had not fallen, and now you were not alone, not entirely. Winter did not rush to Belle-Marie. It crept in slowly like breath against a window pane, like the hush before a snowfall. The air turned sharper each morning, nipping at your fingers as you worked. The trees stood bare, black silhouettes against a pewter sky, their leaves long buried beneath the mossy damp of the forest floor. Even the crows grew quiet. You had lived through many winters before, but none like this. There were fewer fires now. The blacksmith's forge remained cold. The tavern hearth had not seen flame in weeks. Smoke rose from fewer chimneys with each passing day, until only a handful remained, threads winding toward a sky that offered no warmth in return. You rationed your wood. Each log became a calculation, a careful balance between warmth and survival. You cooked once daily, stretching root vegetables and dried beans into thin stews, flavored with herbs gifted by the forest folk. Every drop was a prayer. Food, more than ever, became memory. You remembered the feasts of midsummer lamb roasted with rosemary, thick bread spread with sweet butter, apples bursting with juice. Now your fingers crumbled dried nettle into water and called it soup. But you did not complain. Hunger was not unfamiliar. What chilled the soul was loneliness. Most days, you did not see another soul. The village had hollowed out, not just from death, but from fear and flight. Doors remained barred, paths stayed empty, bells no longer rang, and still the plague whispered on, indifferent to season or sorrow. Yet you kept your rituals each morning. Before lighting the fire, you washed with cold water and a cloth steeped in vinegar. You burned rosemary by the door. You swept the floor 3 times not for dirt, but for order. Small acts of care that reminded the body it was still worth tending, even when the world seemed to forget. One evening, you heard singing faint, broken, carried on the wind. It came from the chapel. You wrapped yourself in your thickest wool and stepped into the frost. The village lay in hush, roofs dusted with white, smoke absent from most homes. As you approached the chapel, you saw a dim light flickering through the slats in the wooden door. Inside, Father Audric knelt before the altar, his voice thin but steady, reciting the litany of saints. The building was empty but for him, yet he spoke as if heaven itself listened. You did not step in, you only watched, heart stilled by the sight. As you turned to leave, he looked up. His eyes met yours, tired but not hollow. "Keep your light," he said softly. "Even the cold ends." That night, you added a new ritual, lighting a candle before sleep. Not for prayer, but as a promise. One flame, one breath, one more day endured. The snow came gently in mid-December. It blanketed the village in silence, so complete it seemed the world had forgotten movement. Footsteps vanished within moments. Roofs sagged beneath the weight. Paths disappeared. But in that stillness, you found something strange, a kind of peace. The sickness seemed to pause. Whether slowed by the cold or stilled by fear, fewer grew ill in those weeks. The quiet became less about dread and more about rest. Those who remained began to emerge just slightly. A nod across the path, a loaf of bread left on a step, small gestures of life. One morning, you found a bundle of firewood outside your door, tied with a red ribbon. You did not know who left it. You didn't need to dot in the forest. The small camp still held. You visited once before the year's end, bearing chestnuts and dried apples. The girl met you halfway, smiling with wind-chapped cheeks. She handed you a length of pine resin, carefully wrapped, for ceiling cracks, she said. Cold finds holes quicker than mice. You stayed until nightfall, sharing broth around the fire, stories drifting lazily between the trees. They had survived, too. Not untouched, but intact. Isabeau's hair had silvered more. Albin's hands were stiff with cold, but they were warm with each other. On the walk home, snow fell again, light and soft, like the brush of lace. You listened to the hush of it against your cloak and realized winter no longer felt like a punishment. It was simply another season. One to be endured, yes, but also witnessed, and so you endured. You made a calendar of pebbles on your shelf, moving one each day from left to right, a simple mark of time, of progress, of days survived. When the first green bud appeared on the elder tree outside your home, your breath caught. It was not much, just one bloom, barely open, but it was enough. Spring would return. The plague had not yet passed, but neither had you. You who had listened, you who had watched, you who had remained kind in the face of silence, you who had not forgotten the shape of hope. Even as the world changed around you, winter had waited, but so had you, and soon the snow would melt. It began with birdsong, soft, tentative, and uncertain at first. A few high chirps at dawn, so faint they might have been imagined. Then, more surely, the trill of a blackcap just beyond the old mill, its voice clear against the stillness that winter had laid across Bella Mary. You were splitting kindling when you heard it. You paused, the axe resting against a stump, and turned your head slightly. There it was, again, a bright, clean note, like the turning of a page. The birds had returned, and with them the first hints of spring. The snow had not yet fully melted, but it receded each day, pulling back like a weary tide. Beneath it, green waited, shoots of nettle, shy crocuses peeking up through the thaw, moss returning to stone. The elder tree outside your home bore tiny buds, no bigger than a grain of rice, but swelling with promise. After months of colorless days, even the faintest green felt like a hymn. Bella Mary stirred, gently. A door opened near the square. A figure swept a doorstep. Somewhere, someone began to mend a fence, though the wood had cracked in the cold. It wasn't bustled, it was breath. A slow inhale after a long-held silence. You too felt it. Your steps grew less cautious. Your shoulders uncurled. The routines you had kept through winter washing, sweeping, boiling, praying remained. But now they were not merely shields against fear. They had become habits of care, of quiet strength. One morning, as you fetched water from the well, you saw a child watching from behind a shutter. He didn't hide when you looked up. He simply blinked, then lifted his hand in a slow, cautious wave. You returned it. The next day, there was chalk on the well's stone lipper, simple drawing of a bird. No words, no names, just a bird, wings spread. The chapel bell rang again in mid-March, only once. Its voice was rusty and strained, but it echoed all the same, startling sparrows into flight. You stood at your door, listening, your heart lifting with the sound, not because it signaled safety, but because it meant someone still believed in the rhythm of time. Father Odric stood beneath the oak that afternoon, speaking to no one in particular. His words were simple, spoken aloud to the wind. Let those who remain come forth, not for answers, just for each other. 5 people came. You were one of them. The others were older, quieter, faces you had seen before, now grown thinner. Number, embraces, no touching, just presence. Together, you stood beneath the old oak and listened to the birds. A week later, someone left baskets outside the healer's home, filled with wool, dried beans, a worn blanket, and a small wooden cross. You recognized the cross. It had once belonged to the weaver's boy, now gone. It was an offering, a remembrance, a kindness. The birds grew louder with each dawn. They sang even when it rained. Their nests appeared in eaves and hollow trees. The cats began to follow them again, ears perked, tail twitching with interest. And you, without meaning, to you, began to hum. You hadn't sung in months, not since the last midsummer. The melody was shapeless, born of memory and hope. You sang while you swept, while you tended to the hearth, while you watched buds unfurl into leaf. One day, on the path to the forest, you met Isabeau. She had come alone, her arms filled with fresh thyme and dried fish. She smiled, though her eyes had grown more lined. It feels different, she said. You nodded, less like ending. She knelt beside the old stone where you'd once exchanged bread for mushrooms and placed the bundle down gently. The birds have returned to us, she whispered. They always know when it's time. From her, you learned that their small forest camp had suffered too. 2 had died in the winter, 1 old, 1 young, but the rest had held on. They had found new ways to stay warm, new plants to dry, new songs to share, and like you, they had begun to hope again. Hope is not loud. It does not come in parades or fireworks. It comes like birdsong at dawn, quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore once heard. And so the village began to change, not quickly, not completely, but change nonetheless. More doors opened. Paths were swept. Children peered from behind fences. Smoke once again curled from chimneys, not in mourning, but in rhythm. The smell of bread rill, leavened bread drifted through the square one morning, and the baker's oven glowed again. People began to speak of gardens, of planting, of what seeds remained. You too turned your eyes to the earth. You had a few tucked away beans, peas, and the brittle ends of garlic. You worked the soil slowly, whispering to it as you once had in autumn. Your hands, rough and lined, moved with reverence. The ground, despite everything, accepted your touch. At night, you lit your candle and wrote small things into the soot of your hearth. Names, moments, songs. A record not for history, but for your own soul. And always, the birds sang, you began to learn their patterns, their calls. The robins warble, the thrushes chime, the larks trill at noon. They did not fear the village. They sang for what remained, and you listened as you always had. Spring pressed its palms deeper into the soil, and the earth silent all winter began to open. The frost retreated fully now. Dew clung to the grass in the morning, and the sun stretched longer across the hills with each passing day. The village of Bellameri did not burst into life. It unfolded gently, like a bud easing toward bloom. And in this slow awakening, something sacred returned to the land. The garden, it began with one patch of turned soil near the chapel steps. Small, rough. A dozen lines carved into the earth by hand, no tools but a spade and time. The priest, Father Audric, dug it himself. He did not speak while he worked. He did not sing. He simply moved soil from one place to another, whispering with each press of his palm. The next morning, a child came and planted a single seed. No one asked what kind. Soon others followed, not all at once, not in groups, but one by one, drawn to that patch of earth like moths to warmth. They brought what they had: dunion sets, old beans, even dried roots, things forgotten in drawers, in baskets, in pockets. They planted without asking if it would grow. They planted because they needed something too. You watched from a distance at first. Your own plot, behind your cottage, had already begun to change. The garlic tips pushed green through brown soil. The peas clung to the stakes you'd shaped in winter. You worked in silence, careful with each movement, knowing that in a world stripped of certainty, planting was a defiance gentle but firm. And one day, you brought a bundle of young thyme and laid it beside the chapel garden. No words, just. Offering Mailing came to, wearing a cloak patched with memories. She carried sage and feet. She knelt without a sound, her hands more sure than ever, placing roots into earth like prayers. Gardening in those days was not for harvest alone. It was ritual, it was remembrance. Each seed was a name, a moment, a piece of grief pressed gently into the ground. Some villagers carved symbols beside their rows, a line for each loved one lost, a circle for a family departed, a cross for those who had passed unseen. The soil held these symbols quietly, as it always had. Earth does not question, it only receives. You began to spend more time in your garden, not because it needed you, but because you needed it. There was comfort in the repetition. Water, we'd whisper, the sound of hands brushing earth, the satisfaction of green rising from darkness. You spoke softly as you worked, sometimes to yourself, sometimes to the cat watching lazily from a stone wall, and sometimes to the garden itself. Grow well, you'd murmur. Grow brave. Bellameri shifted. Paths grew more defined again, pressed by footsteps. Chickens wandered freely now, their clucks adding rhythm to the day. Children emerged in pairs, cautious but curious. They watched the bees return to the heather and pointed at the clouds shaped like sails. Someone reopened the well house, cleaning the moss from the stone rim. Another repaired a broken window with horn and twine. No one announced these acts. They simply happened. The village had become a garden, not perfect, not untouched, but tended. Father Audric, now thinner than ever, would sit near the chapel garden and hum softly. Sometimes he read aloud from the Psalms, but more often he simply sat, a presence among plants. His voice, when it came, was always gentle. "This," he said once, gesturing to the rows of growing things, "this is resurrection, not in glory, in green." You came to believe him. One morning, while watering your beans, you found something new, a folded scrap of cloth pinned to a stake. Inside, a handful of seeds, tiny oval, striped with purple. You did not know who left them. Perhaps from the forest folk. Perhaps not. You planted them anyway. Not everything grew. Some plots failed. The earth was tired in places, the seeds old. But even in failure, there was meaning. Weeds still sprang up. Worms still turned soil. The land, in its way, refused to be idle. In time, you began to share again. A bundle of radishes left at my door, a knot of dill hung on the chapel gate. A clay cup of rosemary passed quietly between hands during a visit. No, one called these gifts. They were answers. The plague had not vanished. Now and then, someone still fell ill, a cough, a fever, a shadow behind the eyes. But the panic was gone. In its place was understanding. Distance, yes. Care, yes. But not cruelty. People had learned, and you perhaps, without knowing, had helped teach them. Through calm, through quiet, through the garden by mid-spring. Birds nested openly near the chapel. Bees buzzed in the lavender that Mayline had coaxed from brittle roots. And children had begun to name the Rose Sparrow Lane, St. Onion's Walk, the patch of hidden things. You smiled when you heard them. You could not undo the sorrow. But you had planted something alongside it, and it had taken root. As spring deepened and blossoms crept along hedgerows, a new question stirred beneath the surface of daily life in Bellamere, quieter than fear, older than hunger. What remains when so much is gone? Survival, though sacred, is not without its cost. And in the wake of loss, each soul who remained began, slowly, to sort through the pieces of a life interrupted. The things we chose to keep were not always grand. For some, it was a bowl, old earthenware, chipped at the rim, but tied to the memory of hands that once filled it. It held no gold, no secrets, but it had held soup on a cold night, laughter on a warm one. Its presence said, someone lived here. For others, it was a song, hummed in the garden, beneath breath, passed from mother to child, from friend to wind. Not written, not precise, just melody enough to warm silence. Mayline, for her part, often sang while drying herbs, her voice low and sweet as river moss. You too kept things. A piece of ribbon from your sister's cloak, a carved spoon you had shaped for a midsummer feast long past, a feather dropped by a jay on the morning after. Your fever broke. They sat together in a small woven basket, not displayed, not hidden just. There, Isabeau once said, we survive with our hands, but we remember with our fingertips. And so you touched these things gently each day, but just as we chose. What to hold on to, we also chose what to release. The great ledger that hung in the town hall, its names now half erased by dust, was not consulted again. There was no more need for records of trade, of favor owed, of grain exchanged. The world had been reset, and the rules that governed it were being rewritten by those who still breathed. The tavern's sign, once painted bright with a fox chasing a goose, had fallen in a storm and was never rehung. No one missed it. The tavern itself had become a quiet place, sits tables used now for drying plants, for stitching cloth, for gathering not in revelry but in stillness. Some rituals faded no longer did villagers mark time with grand festivals or crowded processions. Instead, they honored the turning year with quiet offerings. A braid of wheat left at a doorstep, a branch of hazel hung above a gate. Simpler now, more heartfelt. One evening, you were invited wordlessly to join a gathering in the chapel. There were only 8 people, seated in a half circle, each holding a small object. No one spoke for a long time. Then one by one, they placed their objects before the altar. A bell, a lock of hair, a spindle, a child's wooden shoe. Each represented someone lost. Each left behind not to forget, but to remember differently. You placed nothing that night, but your hands closed gently around the ribbon in your pocket, and that was enough. Among the things we kept were stories, strange ones, soft ones, new ones that shaped the old into meaning. Children asked where the sickness had gone, and some answered with tales of wind spirits or dark birds flown back eastward. Others told of the forest that swallowed sorrow and grew flowers in its place. And still others, like Maylene, explained gently how not all things can be seen, but can still be understood. You began to write small lines on bark and stone, keeping notes of what you'd learned, not just of herbs or habits, but of choices, of kindness, of restraint, of how stillness sometimes saved more lives than medicine. The cat, who had followed you through it all, now slept longer in the sun. He wandered less and purred more. Even animals, it seemed, understood the change. One day, while tending your garden, you unearthed a piece of pottery broken, painted in faded blue. It had no value, but it had been made by hands. It had been touched. That was enough to keep it. A new ritual formed that spring. Each person still in Bellamary began to place one item not of grief, but of memory on a ledge built near the chapel wall. A shelf of stories, it was called. It held a worn shoe, a comb, a stone with a face carved into it. Visitors, if ever they came, would find no plaque, no explanation, only pieces of a people who endured. The forest folk, too, had their ways. Isabeau told you they did not keep possessions, but they remembered through place. A hollow tree was named for a boy who loved to climb. A glade near the brook was where a child had once danced with fireflies. Memory, for them, was tied not to objects, but to earth. You visited them still, sometimes bringing food, sometimes only silence. They had survived as you had, not through strength, but through care. The days grew longer, and what once felt like recovery now began to feel like living. The birds built nests again. The wheat in the fields reached skyward, and people smiled, not often, not loudly, but without shame. You sat one evening beneath your elder tree, the sky brushed with gold, and held the ribbon in your hand. You didn't cry, you didn't speak, simply remembered, and that was all the keeping you needed. The road that led into Bellamary had once been well worn. Carts had trundled over it each week, merchants bringing grain, pilgrims seeking shelter, peddlers with baskets full of trinkets, rumors, and songs. But for many months now, it had lain, still, claimed by moss and silence. Then, one morning, you heard wheels at first. It was just a faint groan wooden axles turning beneath tired weight. You looked up from your garden and across the valley, saw dust rise along the southern path. Not much, just a slow swirl. You stood at your gate, heart quiet but watchful. A single cart approached. It moved slowly, drawn by a grey mule with ribs visible beneath its hide. The driver wore a long cloak, face half covered by a cloth, eyes narrow from squinting into the sun. Behind him, the cart held bundles, nothing grand, nothing shining. Just tools, cloth, small barrels. The village did not rush to greet him, but no one turned him away. He stopped by the chapel, climbed down slowly, and waited. Father Odric came first, then Mayline, then you. He introduced himself simply, Thomas, from a hamlet called Veressels, once home to 50, now home to 7. He had been sent to see if Bellamori still stood. You invited him to sit in the square. He shared water. You shared bread, and slowly words passed between you. He spoke of the road quiet still, but no longer empty, of small settlements blinking back to life, of towns where fires had burned unchecked, and now green crept between broken stone, of places where people lived close again risky, yes, but bold in their yearning for life. He told you of distant bells ringing once more, of fields being tilled, of markets stirring with low voices and guarded smiles. You listened, and when he left the next morning, he carried a note, not written in ink but carved carefully into birch bark. It listed names, the living, the lost, and those who would welcome word from kin. From that moment on, the road began to breathe again, not with the bustle of the old days, but with cautious movement. Each week, someone passed through alone, sometimes in twos, pilgrims in faded robes, widows seeking family, monks bearing food and silence. Each one carried something, even if only a story. And in return, they took something from belmarie.news.seeds.hope. The first trade came with a woman named Eloine, who brought goat cheese and traded for rosemary and linen. She stayed only one night, sleeping in the tavern's long quiet loft. Before she left, she lit a candle in the chapel and whispered, "I never thought I'd see other souls again." A quiet merchant followed weeks later, offering clay pots in exchange for dried apples. He had walked for days. He wept when someone shared hot broth with him. Paths, once feared, had become precious again. Not everyone approved. Some villagers kept their shutters tight, their minds wary. They feared the sickness would ride the carts as before, hidden in wool and breath. But no longer did they strike or curse. They watched, waited, and whispered prayers instead. And slowly, trust-like, ivy on old stone began to climb again. You marked each arrival with care. You offered sage water for hands, warm tea for the road. You asked no questions, but listened to all offered in turn. You learned of other places, of a town where puppeteers performed again for children, their voices thin but joyful, of a convent where nuns had painted murals on every wall to remind themselves they still lived, of a bridge rebuilt by hand, stone by stone, not for trade, but for the joy of crossing. One traveller, a young man with ink-stained fingers, carried a book. He let you read a page. It was a record collected thoughts from villagers like yours, not just losses, but learnings, practices that saved, foods that nourished, remedies that calmed. You asked to copy one recipe, a blend of juniper, sage, and vinegar used to cleanse wounds. He smiled and gave you the page. That night, by candlelight, you transcribed it into your growing collection, your quiet ledger of wisdom, and Bella was not alone anymore. One day, while fetching water, you saw two figures, a riverman and his sister, who once lived near the old mill. They had survived elsewhere, but returned now to reclaim their father's house. Their steps were hesitant, but their eyes were bright. You helped them clear the doorway, sweep the dust, mend the broken shutter. They thanked you with onions and a song from their childhood. The melody drifted over the fields like wind over wheat. The road that had once brought the plague had become a thread of healing, not just in what it carried, but in what it symbolized: connection. You never rushed to travel it yourself, but you began to write names of places you might one day walk, to written not in ink, but in your thoughts as you worked the garden, stirred the stew, fed the cat. One day, you told yourself, but not today. Today you would wait by the chapel steps and watch the path. Today, someone else might arrive, and you would be ready, with wealth, nor with fanfare, but with warmth, with listening, and with the quiet strength of someone who had lived through silence and still chosen to speak. It was just before dusk when the pilgrim arrived. The sky had turned the color of soft wine, and the wind carried the scent of warmed earth and elderflower. You had just finished tying up your beans when you noticed the figure walking steadily up the southern path. No cart, no mule, no companions. Only a walking staff and a candle tied with linen hanging from their belt. The pilgrim wore a cloak of faded blue, patched at the hem, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed their face. Around their neck hung a string of carved wooden beads, each a different shape, some smooth, some worn with worry. They did not speak as they entered Bella, but they paused near the old well and bowed their head. You approached quietly, offering a jug of water and a crust of bread. The pilgrim accepted both with a slow nod and sat on the well's low wall. After a moment of silence, their voice rose soft, lower than birdsong. "My name is Ari. I've come to remember the forgotten." The words were strange, but not unkind. You guided them to the chapel steps, where Father Odric and Mayline joined you. R.A. removed their hat. Their hair was white not with age, but with something like moonlight. Their eyes, when they met yours, seemed to see both past and present all at once. That evening, a quiet gathering formed. Not many came, 12 in all, but that was more than most nights. The square was lit with oil lamps and a handful of candles. You brought your stool. The baker's widow brought tea. And when all was settled, R.A. untied the candle from their belt and held it before them. "This," they said, "has travelled with me from village to village, where stories were left behind, not ones written, not sung, just those remembered." In silence, they lit the candle with a flint and held it carefully. "I've come to offer a story, not mine, yours." No one spoke, so R.A. began. They told of a village, not unlike Bella, of how it had once been bright and busy, and how it grew quiet. Of how people vanished not only from fever, but from fear. How friends turned from one another, how doors stayed closed long after the danger had passed. But then, one girl, a weaver's daughter, lit a candle in her window each night, refusing to let grief silence her. Each evening, she told a story to the flame. A name, a joke, a moment remembered. And though no one came at first, others began to listen from behind their shutters. And slowly, they too began to light candles. And slowly, the village began to speak again by the end of the tale. The flame flickered tall in the still air. No one moved. Then R.A. said, "I've carried this candle from that place. Each village that welcomes me adds one name to its light. Not written, just spoken, once, aloud." Silence lingered. Then Mayline stepped forward. She bent low, her hands trembling slightly, and whispered, "Emil." R.A. nodded. Then another voice, Joan, and another Banut. Names once whispered only in dreams now passed into the air, into the flame. You stepped forward last. You said the name you had not spoken aloud in many months. The ribbon in your pocket curled tightly in your palm, Leon. The flame bowed. Gently, R.A. closed their eyes. They are carried now. That night, you did not sleep. You sat by your window, watching the stars return to their patient places. You thought of the story and the village that lit candles to remember. You thought of those you'd loved, and those you'd only known in passing. And you realized stories were more than memory. They were bridges in the morning. R.A. remained. They walked the village slowly, pausing by gardens, nodding at rebuilt walls, listening to the sound of birds and children again in the air. They spoke to the weaver's apprentice about cloth patterns and how the wind changes thread tension. They shared a recipe for a tonic made from pine needles and honey. They traced a prayer into the dust near the chapel gate knot. Words but symbols. You joined them at the edge of the forest later that day. Together you walked a path lined with hawthorn and watched squirrels leap between branches. They asked nothing of you. They only said, you listened. That is why you lived. When they left that evening, you walked with them to the rise beyond the village. They turned once, lifting the candle, still unextinguished, and bowed. The path continues, R.A. said, but so does the telling. And then they were gone, but the flame, though small, remained. That night, you placed your own candle on the chapel windowsill. You lit it with care, and as it burned, others followed. One by one, gentle flames appeared across. Belle Marie, not to chase away darkness, but to honor it, to light what remained, to warm what might still come. No one knew who rang the bell first. Perhaps it was Father Odric, his hands steadied by the return of prayer. Perhaps it was the weaver's apprentice, moved by a memory. Or maybe it was a traveller who, pausing at the chapel gate, pulled the frayed rope simply to see if sound still lived inside its weight. But whatever the hand, the bell rang. It called once. A deep, round tone, neither mournful nor jubilant, but full. You heard it while pulling weeds from your garden, hands covered in soil. And Rosemary, you stopped mid-motion, heart suddenly still. And around the village, others paused as wellheads lifted. Breath held, then it rang again. This time longer, and with it, a memory stirred not of the plague, but of mornings long before it, of feast days, of harvests, of weddings and baptisms, of a time when sound stitched people together in the rhythm of shared life. The third toll came like a heartbeat. You stood, brushed the dirt from your hands, and walked toward the chapel. You were not the only one. They came slowly like shadows, returning at dusk, from cottages and cellars, from gardens and pathways. A few came barefoot. Some held hands. Most walked in silence, but in the same direction, toward the bell, toward each other by the time the sun dipped below the trees. Nearly every soul who remained in Bellamurray had gathered in the chapel square. The light was golden, soft, draping, the stone walls in warmth. Bees hovered near lavender. A robin perched on the lintel above the door. No one spoke at first. The silence was not heavy, was reverent, as if the land itself paused to listen. Then Mayline stepped forward. She placed a bundle of time at the chapel threshold, a gift of cleansing, of strength. Behind her, the baker's widow carried a loaf, round, dark, fragrant with caraway, and set it beside the herbs. A child placed a single feather. Father Audric, leaning on his staff, whispered a line from the Psalms. They that sow in tears shall reap in joy. One by one, others followed. Not all had offerings. Some brought only themselves. But that, too, was enough. You found yourself moving without thought, your feet gentle against the stone. From your pocket, you drew the ribbon, the one that had travelled with you through silence and frost and fevered nights. You knelt and laid it atop the bread, a thread of memory, a piece of love. The bell rang once more, this time not from hands, but from the wind catching its wooden tongue, a clear, sweet sound that lingered longer than it should have. Then, slowly, a song began, not from one voice, but from many low at first, barely a hum, a hymn known by heart, not for melody but for meaning. In the valley of shadows, I walk not alone. The words carried no doctrine, only comfort. You joined in, your voice rough with disuse but steady. The song wove through the square like smoke curling into the rafters of the chapel, lifting toward the trees. For the first time since the plague arrived, Bella Mary sang as one. No instruments, no choirs, just breath and memory and hope. When the hymn faded, the silence that followed was different. Not afraid, not empty, but held. Father Audric stepped forward once more. His face was pale, lined with years and sorrow, but his eyes were bright. We are fewer, he said, but we are. That was all, no sermon, no call to penance, just truth. People began to light candles, then some brought, some borrowed, some shaped from tallow just that morning. They lined the chapel steps and windows, the stone wall, the garden's edge. The flames flickered gently, golden petals in the coming night. Children traced shapes in the dust circles, crosses, flowers. An elder shared honeycomb. The merchant's wife passed warm cider, brewed quietly in her hearth. And when darkness fell fully, the village did not retreat. They remained talking, sharing, listening. You sat beside the herb beds, your fingers curled around a clay cup of water. Around you, voices rose not loudly, but with life. Someone laughed, someone wept, someone told a story of how the stars used to speak to travelers, and you listened as you always had. The bell did not ring again that night. It didn't need to. Its echo lived in the quiet, joy that had returned to Bellamore, in the way people touched shoulders once more, in the way someone mended the chapel gate without being asked, in the way candles were left burning long after midnight when you walked home. The path was moonlit. The cat waited for you at the door, eyes half closed, tail wrapped around its feet. Inside, the air was warm. You lit your own candle and placed it by the window, as our Ray had once done, and in its soft light you whispered, "We remember, and we begin again." Summer came as a whisper, not a song. It did not burst into Bellamere with brightness and bustle. It tiptoed across the hills, unfolded like a slow smile. The fields, once grey with ash and absence, warmed under the long sun. Grass returned. Clover peeked through cracks in old stone. The stream, which had murmured so faintly through the hard winter, now sang clear and full again. You felt the change, not all at once, but gently like the easing of a long-held breath. Your garden bloomed. The peas reached your knees, thick with pods. The garlic stretched tall, proud. Calendula bloomed in golden bursts near the fence. And beneath the elder tree, bees worked with quiet grace, unbothered by the memory of silence. The village was healing, not healed, not whole, but healing. And the season welcomed it. There were no grand declarations, no great feast days or banners strung from house to house, but life began to fill the spaces grief had once emptied. Someone mended the bridge at the mill, plank by plank. A new bench appeared beneath the old ash tree. You saw children playing with twigs in the dust, building little houses, naming them after those they missed. Your days, too, filled again, not with urgency, but with rhythm. You rose early, stretched slowly, and washed your face in sage water. You walked the garden, whispering to the leaves as you passed. You cooked simply barley with mushrooms, lentils with thyme, stewed greens, sweetened with a bit of cider when you had it. And each evening, as the sky turned lavender, you wrote one line on a scrap of bark or cloth, a memory, a wish, a lesson. You tied these lines with twine and kept them in a basket by your hearth. Mayline called them harvestings of the heart. Others began to share in the practice. One morning, the baker's widow left a note on your fence. Bread rises slowest when watched. Let it rest. You smiled, folded it carefully, and added it to your basket by midsummer. There were enough of these woven thoughts that the children began to collect them and tie them to tree branches around the village. Words danced in the breeze like leaves soft, reminders of endurance and joy. A gathering took place one warm evening. Without plan or invitation, people simply came to the square, with baskets, with blankets, with songs half remembered and bread still warm from the hearth. You brought honeycomb and dried mint, laid it on a cloth beside sweet apples, and shared without a word. There was music not from instruments, but from voices, old songs, work songs, lullabies, melodies, passed from parent to child before the world had changed. You didn't sing loudly. No one did, but you, Hummed. And around the fire, the village swayed gently in the light. The healing was not only in the body, it lived in the hands, helping each other carry water, in the eyes that met again without flinching, in the way someone would pause beside a gate and simply say, "Still here," and someone else would nod. Double quotes, yes. Still here, one afternoon, a traveller returned not our way, but another from the wider world. He brought seeds from the east, coriander, mustard, and a strange curling bean. He spoke of towns rebuilt with laughter and bridges painted blue. Just because someone liked the color, he stayed a single night, but left behind a carved wooden comb and the recipe for a lemon balm tea that soothed restless dreams. You tried it. That night, sipping slowly while the stars turned in their patient orbits, and you slept, not without dreams, but with peace. The forest folk, too, visited more often. Isabeau came with baskets of wild berries, and Albin shared a story of a fox. They had named Captain, who now watched over their camp with stern eyes and twitching ears. They stayed for a whole afternoon, helping clear the chapel garden, and left just as quietly. Life was not loud now. It was tender. Even grief, when it came, felt different. When Father Odric passed quietly one morning, it did not bring panic. He had grown slower, thinner, and everyone had known it was nearing. He was buried beneath the chapel oak, the roots curling deep and wise. The bell rang once, and the village gathered, not in despair, but in honor. They laid thyme and lavender over his grave, and someone sang the hymn he had loved. You added his name. To your ribbon, summer held its breath, and still you endured. One evening, while walking near the edge of the village, you saw a fox. It stood watching you from a distance, golden-eyed, still. You raised your hand slowly, not to frighten it, only to greet. It did not move. Then, with the same silence in which it had come, it vanished into the brush. You smiled. The world, you understood, would never be the same, but it would still be beautiful, and you, through caution, through care, through compassion, had reached the healing season. The days were long again, and so you rested, you grew, you gave thanks. By the end of summer, the village had grown quiet again, not from fear, but from fullness, the kind of hush that comes not after disaster, but after a long exhale, the kind that comes when one has spoken everything that can be said aloud. At least, and what remains must be placed elsewhere, it began, as many things did in Bellamary, with something small. A child left a folded parchment in the chapel garden, weighed down with a stone. On it, a simple drawing, 3 stick figures, a sun and a heart. Beneath it, 2 words, barely formed, come back. The parchment remained there all day, fluttering in the breeze, until the evening wind lifted it gently into the hedgerow. But it had already been seen. The next day, another parchment appeared, then another dot, and another dot, not all drawings. Some were notes, some were names, some were nothing more than a scribbled line and a tear-shaped stain. They came to be called letters, to no one, placed in quiet corners, hung from the chapel gate, tied to tree limbs with bits of thread. Not messages for response, but messages for release. You watched the practice grow, quietly at first. Then one night, you wrote one of your own. You sat by the fire, the cat asleep in your lap, the smell of mint and smoke soft in the air. You took a scrap of linen, dipped your quill in a berry-dyed ink, and wrote slowly. You did not write a name. You didn't need to. Just a few words. I remember your laugh on rain-soaked mornings. You folded the cloth gently and placed it in the crook of the elder tree. The next morning, it was gone by nightfall, perhaps taken by wind, or fox, or the forest itself. But it had been released. The letters began to travel. Some were found pinned, 2 fences, some nestled in baskets of apples. A few were tucked inside shoes left by the chapel steps, or wrapped around garden stakes as offerings to the soil. You found one tied to your gate, a week after your own, a single line in familiar script. You taught me how to be quiet without being alone. It stayed there for days before the rain washed it away, and still the letters came. Mayline burned hers in her hearth, the ashes mixed with lavender and cedar. She said the smoke carried them better than feet ever could. The baker's widow tied hers into a garland of bread twists, left on the chapel door each Sabbath. Father Odric's grave, over time, grew surrounded not just by herbs and stones, but by words. Tiny scrolls tucked under roots, names etched in bark, prayers murmured into the breeze. The act itself became a ritual, not for mourning, not entirely, but for presence, for giving the unseen shape. Sometimes, travellers left letters to one woman. From the far west laid a folded map beneath the well bucket. On it, a path traced in ink and marked with a single phrase, I survived. I miss who I was before. You added it to your basket of collected stories. A record, not of history, but of heart. One evening, you sat with Isabeau by the fire, sipping broth from wooden cups. She brought no letter that night, but she spoke aloud what she might have written. I once feared the forest would forget me, but I've learned that trees remember through our touch. You nodded, you understood. That night you wrote again, this time to yourself. A note folded beneath your pillow. You did not disappear. You were simply quiet long enough to heal. In the weeks that followed, Bella Murray grew rich with unspoken words. The chapel wall shimmered with ribbons of writing. The old oak bore verses carved with reverent care. The market stall once empty held. A woven basket marked "Take one, if you need one," inside. Messages from strangers, blessings, memories, promises. Not all letters were sad, some were full of hope. I planted your favorite mint again. She asked about your name today. We dance now, even without music. And still, some letters remained unread, left for the sky, for the soil, for the quiet gods of healing and memory. You wrote less over time, but more deeply. Each word was chosen, each sentence like planting a seed. One final letter you tied to the edge of your window, where morning light always touched first. It said, "If you ever return, the garden waits. The door is open, the kettle is warm." You do not know who it was for, but writing it brought peace. And so the letters continued. Village of voices, of whispers in ink and smoke, no longer silenced, no longer afraid, just present, alive, and ever listening. In the cool light of early autumn, when the air smelled of dried straw and ripe plums, a new project began, not with words, but with thread. The idea came from Liane, the weaver's apprentice. She was not loud, nor given to speeches. She worked with her hands, her eyes always half-shadowed by curls of dark hair. When she spoke, it was often with fabric, with folds, with weft, with the gentle click of wooden tools. And one morning, she stood before the chapel with a bolt of blank linen and a basket of thread. "I want to make a map," she said, "not of roads or rivers, but of the village as it had become. As we are now," she explained, "not as it was, not as it's written, but as we remember." At first, the others hesitated. What use was a map when the village paths could be walked in 10 minutes? What could threads say that memory could not? But you understood. You stepped forward first. You placed a pebble in her basket, a mark for the garden, you said. For the way it healed more than hunger. And with that, the weaving began. Each day Liane returned to the chapel steps and unrolled her linen across a simple wooden frame. She set her spindle beside it and waited, and the village came, one by one. Not with maps, but with memories. Mayline brought a sprig of yarrow, dried and wrapped in silk. "For the place where I first felt safe again," she said. We hung yarrow in every doorway that winter. A child offered a feather. This bird flew into our house and stayed 3 days. Mama said it carried someone's soul. The baker's widow handed Liane a spool of pale blue thread. "Use this for the sky," she whispered. "It has not left us." Liane asked questions softly. Where was the first herb planted? Where did the fox cross your path? Where did you sit when you first felt hope again? Each answer became a stitch, a shape, a line of light sewn into cloth. You returned. Often you brought your ribbon and asked her to use its color to mark the bench beneath. The elder Tretha, place where you had first written a letter to no one. She smiled, cut a single strand, and wove it into the weft with reverence. The map took shape slowly, not like a chart, but like a tapestry. The chapel was not marked by walls, but by candles. The path to the well shimmered with tiny beads sewn to echo raindrops. The forest edge curved gently across one side, not with fear, but with threads dyed green and silver. Like the hush of leaves in moonlight, there were no names on the map, no property lines, only memory, emotion, story when travelers passed through. They were invited to sit with Leanne. Some shared a name, some pointed to where they'd rested, some wept. Their presence was marked by color-burnt orange for those passing through sorrow, soft rose for those who shared laughter, and when they left, she stitched tiny wings near where they'd paused. Wanderers, witnesses, carriers of story, the cloth had grown too large for one frame, so others built a longer table, using timber from a fallen barn. They sanded it smooth, oiled it with lavender, and placed it beneath the great oak. The map was spread each morning, protected by muslin, and added to only in light. Leanne never stitched in darkness. Thread remembers intention, she said. Let it carry warmth. The map became more than a cloth. It became a gathering, a reason, a reflection. Sometimes people came only to sit and look, to trace their finger along a path of gold, where sunlight always fell just so, to place a pebble near a stitched flame, recalling the night the bell rang again, to whisper names they could no longer say aloud. The cat, too, found a spot always, curled beneath the corner stitched with your garden, as if he knew. One evening, Leanne approached your door. In her hands, a square of cloth, stitched with care. This is yours, she said, not to keep, but to know. You unfolded it. A patch of earth, a small tree, a candle in the window, and, rising from the chimney, smoke stitched with the faintest curl into a word. Still, you pressed it to your chest, not because it was perfect, but because it was true by the first frost. The map had grown to cover nearly half the square table. Leanne continued, hands steady, even as the cold nipped her fingertips. Others brought her mittens, tea, song, and the village had found its shape. Again, not in stone, not in scrolls, but in cloth, in thread, in touch, in care, the map said. We were here. We changed. We remembered . And perhaps more than that, we are becoming again. He arrived just as the frost began to lace the mornings, not with a cart, nor with fanfare, but with a quiet song and the scent of beeswax. The villagers called him the Honeyman, though he gave no name. His hair was sun-coloured, streaked with grey, his cloak patched with pollen-dusted cloth. He carried no belongings save for 2 hives in wicker baskets, and a satchel filled with jars and burr glass that caught the light. Like stained windows, he came with no trade and made no promises. Follow the flowering, he said softly, and the flowering follows the fire. It was Mayline who first welcomed him, guiding him to the edge of her herb garden, where thyme and borage still lingered, defiant in the cooling air. You've come late in the year, she said. He smiled. The bees prefer what others forget. He placed his hives beneath the elder tree, where your cat sniffed them once, sneezed, and promptly decided they were to be respected. And from the moment he arrived, Bella Marie began to smell faintly of honey and smoke. You met him near the well. He handed you a Jarno label, only a wax seal pressed with the mark of a bee. For what you've lost, he said, and what you've kept. You opened the jar that evening, letting the golden sweetness melt into hot cider. Its taste was like late summer floral, smoky, unexpected, not like the old honey. Better, somehow. More honest. The villagers grew curious. Each day they passed by the elder tree, where the honeyman knelt beside his bees, whispering to them, never rushing. Children watched from a distance. Some brave ones came closer. He showed them how to move gently, how to breathe softly. They listened to calm, he told them, not fear. You listened to Dot and learned. He spoke of ashes, of how fire, though feared, returns balance, clears space, makes room. The bees know, he said. They find flowers in fields others call ruined. He showed you how to gather wax, how to twist it into candles that burned without bitterness. He shared stories of hives found in hollow trees, still thriving after storms, of queens who are built with fewer workers, but stronger honey. They do not mourn what they cannot rebuild, he said, but they remember. In sweetness, the villagers began to bring him offerings, not for trade, but thanks. A loaf of bread, a skein of thread, a handful of late-season rose hips. He accepted all with grace, and in return offered wisdom stitched with silence. One morning, he held a beeswax candle to the light. This, he said, is fire made soft, grief made useful. This is what it means to survive. You began to write these phrases down, adding them to your basket of stories. He never asked you to, but once, he glanced at your notes and smiled. You're keeping the hive, he said. You weren't sure what he meant, until he left. He did not stay long, lonely 10 days. But before he left, he gathered the village in the chapel garden. He set 3 candles on a flat stone and lit them with a flint. One, he said, for what we lost. He paused. One, for what we still carry. A longer pause. And one, for what will come next. The flames danced together in the wind, small but steady. And then, without another word, he picked up his baskets, bowed low, and walked the path north. You never saw him again. But the bees remained, buzzing softly in the late autumn air. Their hives nestled beside the elder tree. The villagers left them space. Children whispered to them. Maylene planted more lavender near their stones, and you began to work wax. You made candles shaped like petals, like leaves, like hands held in prayer. You gave them freely, not to light the dark, but to soften it. The honey, too, was shared. 1 spoonful for those with dry throats, 1 jar for a traveler bound for another village, and always a taste left in the chapel. On the corner of the altar, where the last 3 candles, those lit by the honeyman, still stood, now melted low, but never fully gone. You came to understand something quiet in those days. Healing does not always bloom. Sometimes it hums, low and steady, beneath the surface, like bees beneath bark, like hearts beneath old grief. It does not need permission, only space and time and kindness, and sometimes a little sweetness. By the time the leaves had turned fully gold and the birds began to gather on fence posts, Bella Murray had learned the rhythm of preparation again, not in haste, but in grace. The second winter since the shadow came was near, but this time it did not bring dread, only attention. Care. The kind of care born not from panic, but from understanding. You rose each morning with the mist still clinging to the windows. Your breath made small clouds as you stirred the hearth and fed the cat, who now spent most days tucked near the hives, watching bees with a kind of contemplative respect. The gardens, tired but grateful, gave their final gifts. You pulled the last of the carrots, small and sweet from the cold. The kale, dusted with frost, curled like paper. Mayline came by with a basket of dried nettles and shared a root tonic. She had perfected from the honeyman's advice. The villagers moved with gentleness. They patched roofs. They oiled hinges. They stuffed moss into the cracks where wind had whispered. Through the planks last year, there were no shouts, no demands. Only footsteps on damp earth and the low hum of work songs returned Leanne. The weaver brought out warm cloaks she had stitched from wool gathered the spring before. Each bore a small emblem, unique to the wearer, an herb leaf, a fox's tail, a single thread of blue, not for decoration, but remembrance. The map she had woven now rested beneath glass in the chapel. A lantern hung above it, lit each night, casting its soft flicker across the stitches. New stories were added not with thread now, but with stones and tokens placed on its edge. You placed a dried bean there. It was from your first harvest, tiny, brown-speckled. It held nothing spectacular, except everything. Father Odric's tree had grown taller. Its leaves, golden in the waning sun, rustled above his resting place with the same voice you once heard in the forest. Calm, watchful, patient. Children gathered leaves beneath it, building small houses from twigs and singing. To the earth, they no longer whispered the word plague. They called it the quiet year. And perhaps, in some way, they were right. The quiet had taught them to listen. The quiet had taught you all. This year, before the first snow, the village gathered, not for mourning, but for intention. It was Maylene's idea, a simple ritual each. Family or soul who remained was asked to bring a light for the long dark. It could be a candle, a word, a song, or a memory. You brought your ribbon again, now frayed and faded. It still held its shape. You tied it to a branch just outside the chapel door, where the wind could lift it but not carry it away. Others followed, a pair of knitted gloves from Leanne, a shell from a traveller who had passed through, a wooden carving from the baker's widow, 2 hands cupped around a seed. And then came the voices, soft, rising like steam. Old songs, invented songs, laughter. Someone tapped a drum made from stretched leather and oak. Someone else passed around a sweetbread shaped like the sun. You sat beside the fire pit, watching shadows flicker across the stone, and felt something you had not felt last year, not just survival, belonging. The night grew colder, but no one left early. They stayed, wrapped in cloaks, pressed shoulder to shoulder beneath the stars. The moon rose, silent and round, and from somewhere beyond the trees, an owl called once and was answered later, back in your cottage. You lit the last of the honeyman's candles. Its flame was low, steady. You brewed time tea and opened your journal, now thick with bark paper entries, drawings, and pressed leaves. You wrote, "This winter, we do not prepare to endure, we prepare to remember, to restore, to return." Sighed. The frost thickened, but the windows held. The food stores, modest but ready, stood in baskets along the wall. The cat curled on your feet, and the bees quiet now rested in their hive. Wrapped in layers of straw and smoke, they would wake again as you would. The next morning, the frost did not melt, but it did not bite. You walked to the well, where someone had placed a clay lantern. Inside, a wick soaked in beeswax still glowed. You warmed your hands by it and closed your eyes, and in that stillness you felt it. The snow would come, but so would spring. The first snow came quietly, brushing the rooftops before dawn, soft as flour dust on a baker's apron. It settled over the village like a blanket light, unhurried, serene. No one feared it this year. Instead, they welcomed it, because, this time, they were ready, and they were not alone. Bella Mary entered winter not as a collection of scattered souls, but as a gathering of memory and hands. The houses, once shut in fear, now held candles in their windows. Firelight glowed from hearth to hearth, like stars stitched along a single thread of earth. They called it the season of shared fires. The tradition began with the baker's widow. She had rebuilt her oven once left cold after Lossend began, baking again as soon as the last apples were harvested. Simple loaves at first, then cider bread, then seed cakes shaped like suns. One morning you found a loaf at your doorstep, wrapped in cloth. No note, but the scent of caraway and warmth lingered like a blessing. That evening you brought her dried rosemary in return. She smiled and said nothing. But the next day another loaf appeared, and so it began. Each house began to give what it had, not in abundance, but in rhythm. One neighbor offered lentils, another shared a dried pear wrapped in waxed cloth. Maylene brewed batches of sage tonic and hung them in flasks from the chapel rail. The weaver's apprentice left scarves, knotted, 2 tree limbs, free for the taking. You made candles short, thick, BEESWAX touched, each with a single word carved at the base. Still, warm, near, begin. They disappeared one by one, until only an empty basket remained and a folded note rested inside. Thank you for reminding me. The chapel, once a place of solitary prayer, became a hearth of stories. Every 7th evening, as snow settled thick on the thatch, the villagers gathered within its walls. They brought stools and blankets, steaming cups and quiet hearts. There was no priest now, only presence, and so the stories began. Mayline spoke of a winter 30. Years passed when a bird nested in her chimney and stayed until spring. Leanne told how she once dreamed of a fox who taught her how to stitch snowflakes. You shared a memory of your sister dancing barefoot in the first frost, insisting it sounded like bells beneath her toes. Others joined in. No story was too small. Each one warmed the room, and when the flames dipped low, someone would add another log, and the hush that followed the telling would be as comforting as the tale itself. Outside, the snow deepened, but it did not isolate. Paths between homes were kept clear-shoveled with shared shovels, trodden down by boots worn over borrowed stockings. If someone's firewood pile ran low, it was quietly replenished. If a window cracked in the cold, straw and cloth were pressed in without a word. The village became, in truth, a hive. Each soul its cell, each cell connected, each warmth extended. Not asked for, not owed. One night, you found a child asleep at your doorstep, her breath frosted against the scarf, tied too loosely at her chin. Her eyes opened as you knelt beside her, wide but unafraid. I was walking to the story fire, she whispered, but I got lost. You wrapped her in your coat and carried her inside. You made her tea, sweetened with a drop of the Honeyman's. Last jar, she fell asleep again beside your hearth. The cat curled at her side. In the morning, her mother came, weeping in gratitude. But you shook your head gently and said, "We are all still finding our way." That day, 3 more children arrived to help you mend the fence behind your cottage. They stayed for soup and left drawings on your door, stars and bees and trees that smiled. The hives beneath the elder trees slept beneath snow and straw, but you visited them still. Each week, you left a pinch of honey at the base, a promise, and one morning, midwinter, you found a small flower pressed into the snow beside one hive, a gift, perhaps from a bird or a child, or the land itself. When the cold bit deepest, Bella Mary did not shrink, it held, in song, in quiet. Footsteps in the shared firelight that danced from one soul to another. And on the coldest night of that winter, the map in the chapel was unrolled against threads still bright, still strong. People added to it, not with stitch, but with warmth. A new log for each story told, a candle for each kindness, a name spoken once more. You wrote only one word in the margin, home. The thaw came not with a rush, but with a murmur. One morning, the icicles that had clung to the eaves since December began to weep. Small, steady drops fell to the stone and pooled like tiny mirrors. You stood at your doorway, wrapped in your heaviest cloak, and watched water return to the land. The earth, which had slept beneath snow and silence, began to stir. The first signs were sense mud, moss, the faint sweetness of last autumn's leaves unburied by the melt. Then came the sounds, the distant gurgle of the stream, birdsong still uncertain, the creak of branches releasing their burden of frost. Bella Mary blinked slowly into spring. You loosened the shutters, one by one, inside your cottage. Light returned in golden pools across the floor. The cat stretched wider each morning, his fur sun-warmed once more. And in the evenings, you opened the window just a crack, letting in the cool breath of awakening soil. The people began to emerge again, not suddenly, not all at once, but like snowdrops rising in patches. They gathered at the chapel steps, brushing the last of the frost from their boots. They carried tools worn smooth by care, seeds folded into cloth, journals written in the hush of winter. Nights. No one spoke of the past season in detail. It had passed, but it had shaped them. Mayline began to walk the garden again, tracing the lines where time would return and calendula might rise again. She carried no basket, only memory. You joined her one afternoon, and together you pressed your hands into the softening earth. It remembers, she said, and you believed her. Leanne brought out new thread dyed with spring greens and soft rose. She had begun a new tapestry, smaller than the map, but brighter. This one, she said, will not show where we've been, but where we might go. She stitched a rising sun in one corner, a road in another, a bird in flight above a village, whose windows still glowed. You helped dig the new planting beds with 3 others' hands, joined not in haste, but in rhythm. When someone unearthed an old spoon, bent and tarnished, it was cleaned and placed on the chapel shelf of found things. Beside a stone carved with a spiral, everything returns. Someone whispered. That night, a soft rain fell. You listened to it from your bed, the candle at your window burning low. You thought of all that had come before the silence, the ache, the careful hope, and you let yourself think forward. The thawing of the earth thawed something in you. To dot you began to dream, not of the past, but of what might yet grow. You dreamt of music in the square, of vines over the chapel roof, of a harvest so plentiful that jars lined every windowsill, of a traveller arriving not with sorrow, but with joy, and of a daysome far morning, when laughter would come without surprise. Others dreamt too. One child declared he would build a new bridge over the stream, wider and painted blue dot. Another planned a festival of bees, complete with honey cakes and flower crowns. Mayline dreamt of an apothecary built from stone, with shelves for every root and salve. You dreamt simply of planting mint by the door again, and of hearing a friend knock just once. In the sunlight, the dreams were not rushed. They unfolded like leaves, cautious but determined. The bees woke, their hum returned to the air, low and steady, and you lit a candle for them, as you always had, placing it near the hive and whispering, "Thanks." That week, the village called a gathering not for mourning, nor for ritual, but to walk together. No path, no plan, just footsteps across the softened fields, down into the vale, past where the fox once watched you from the trees. Children carried baskets to gather early nettles. Elders brought walking sticks worn with memory. You walked in silence at first, then came murmured songs, laughter. Someone offered a story about a goat that once stole Maylene's bonnet. You all laughed until your sides ached, and when the walk ended, you sat on the hill and watched the sun settle behind the chapel. From there, Bellamori looked whole again, not untouched, but complete. Each scar, each hollow space, was part of its shape now. And as you watched, someone pulled out Leanne's new tapestry and unrolled it on the grass. Everyone gathered around. Each thread shimmered in the light. The road, the sun, the bird, and one blank space near the center. Leanne looked up and asked gently, "What shall we stitch here?" No one spoke. Then you, without knowing why, said, "A window with the curtain pulled back. A place for the world to look in, and for the village to look out." She smiled, and she began to sew. Years passed, and Bellameri remained, not as it was, but as it had become woven together by thread and soil, bound by kindness and quiet endurance. The plague never returned in the same way. Whispers came and went, like wind through wheat, but the village had changed. It no longer waited for safety to begin living. It simply lived with care, with memory, with rhythm. The chapel stood firm, ivy curling up its walls, bells ringing now and then not to warn, but to welcome. A garden surrounded it, filled with herbs and song. The elder tree near your home thickened each year, its roots strong and slow. The bees returned again and again, through frost and bloom, and so did you, older, yes, slower, perhaps, but present. You did not write as often now, though your basket of bark paper notes had grown into a small shelf of memory. Visitors sometimes asked to read them. You would smile, offer tea, and say, "Begin anywhere. It's all part of the same story." One summer morning, a traveler came, a young woman with wide eyes and ink-stained fingers. She had heard of Bellameri from someone, somewhere. She came to listen, and so you told her, not everything, not in order, but enough. You spoke of the silence, the fire, the fear, but mostly you spoke of the garden, of the map, of the fox, of the honeyman, and of a ribbon once tied to a tree in memory of someone loved. She wrote it all down, and before she left, she placed a new ribbon at the chapel gate, bright green, freshly cut. "Hope," she whispered, and left it there. The seasons turned. The cat slept more. The winters grew shorter. The children who once built houses of twigs now built their own homes, their own fires, their own dreams. Leanne's tapestry hung proudly above the hearth in the longhouse, updated each year with a new thread, a new memory. Isabeau, when she came down from the forest in spring, would press her palm to the thread that marked the glade where a girl once left bread for a stranger. and she would smile. You sat often now beneath the elder tree, watching, listening. Your hands, though not as quick, still stirred the soil, still pressed seeds, still lit candles. You were no longer afraid of the quiet. You welcomed it one evening. As the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of apricots, you sat by the well and watched the last light touch the stones. A group of children danced nearby, chasing shadows with sticks, their laughter soft as wind chimes. You closed your eyes and saw it all: the first frost, the silent cart, the candle in the chapel, the letters to no one, the song beside the fire. You remembered how it felt to stand alone in a garden and wonder if you would ever see another spring. And you remembered the answer: a breath, a step, a kindness. Survival had not been a battle. It had been a tending of space, of soil, of soul. You rose. Slowly, your joints whispering like reeds in water, and made your way back to your cottage. The hearth glowed with warm coals. The air smelled faintly of honey and rosemary. You lit your final candle of the season and placed it on the windowsill, just as you had so many nights before. And then, sitting in your favorite chair, you opened your journal. The final page was blank. You picked up your quill and wrote, "We lived not in defiance, but in care. We did not flee the silence. We shaped it, and from it we made a home." You set the journal aside. The cat, old and soft, leapt onto your lap. The night deepened, and in the distance, from some path unseen, a bell rang, once low and lovely. You smiled and whispered, "Still here."